Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started with Planning Advisory Committee. We will start this meeting with elections. So I'm looking for nominations for chair. Mark,
I would,
nominate yourself for chair?
yes. Yeah.
Okay. Any other nominations for chair? Not seeing any. Any nominations for vice chair? Nominate someone?
No. Mr. Tag.
Do you accept the nomination?
Yes, sir.
Yes, okay. Any other nominations for vice chair? Seeing none, you are so acclaimed. Do you have the chair's roadmap in front of you, or did you have a physical copy?
I'll take the
Okay.
physical copy today.
Anything highlighted in yellow
Yep.
is what you're gonna go ahead with when you're ready.
Okay. Thank you all. Welcome to the meeting. The meeting is now called to order and roll has been taken. I would like to welcome everyone to the first meeting of the new Planning Advisory Committee meeting and briefly go over some procedural rules for our meeting. The meeting is being held in a hybrid format in accordance with the electronic participation policy for virtual meetings. The full corporate policy 050 is regarding electronic virtual meetings is available for review online. Staff and delegates participating virtually are reminded to keep their video and microphones off until requested by the chair or members of the committee. All cameras for virtual committee members shall remain on to ensure quorum. Members of the committee shall indicate they wish to speak by physically raising their hand. Members who are present in person will be given opportunity to speak first, followed by virtual participants. All members of the committee will vote by a physical show of hands. Please leave your hand raised until the chair has determined the result of the vote. In the event connection or service interruption occurs that affects quorum, we may recess the meeting for up to 15 minutes to regain quorum. If quorum is not achieved, the meeting will be adjourned. All rules for delegations under the city's procedural bylaw continue to apply. So asking the members of the committee, do any of you have any declarations of conflict of pecuniary interest to make on any of the items before the committee? Seeing none, I'll move on. There's one presentation on the agenda for today's meeting. So Paul Lowe's from SGL Planning and Design Inc. is here. As the presentation today encompasses a lot of material with no objection, I would suggest we waive section 15.6.3, presentations of the city's procedural bylaw, which limits presentations to 10 minutes, and section 15.8.6, which requires members to wait until the debate of the item to ask questions of the presenter and staff in order to allow for greater discussion with the consultant. Any objections, please raise your hand. I can see.
There are none on virtually.
Okay, seeing that there are no objections, then I'll turn it over to, I would now ask Paul Lowe's from SGL Planning and Design to come forward and provide a presentation on item 5.1, new zoning bylaw project, discussion papers, and summary report with an introduction from Victoria Coates.
Everyone, yeah, Victoria Coates, Senior Planner in Long Range Planning. We're happy to be back in front of the committee today to provide an update on the new zoning bylaw project, which is focused on preparing a new zoning bylaw that will replace the city's current zoning bylaw, as well as the County of Brant zoning bylaw that applies to the boundary adjustment lands. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Paul to get us started.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So if I can shift down. Should be working on shift down. Okay, perfect. So as many of you know, I can do this with my glasses big enough. Perfect. The zoning bylaw is intended to implement the official plan, and you have a fairly new official plan that was finished years ago. So we're working on creating a zoning bylaw that implements that. And for those on, if there's any that aren't from the committee or the general public, what is a zoning bylaw? Well, what a zoning bylaw does is sets out the uses that are allowed, a little bit more detailed in the official plan, specific uses, and sets out specifically what you can do on a property in terms of where is the use permitted? Where's the building that contains the use to be situated on the lot? So how tall is it? How big is it? What's the side yards? What's the required parking? What's landscaping required on it? That's all set out in the zoning bylaw. So that is a very, very high level simplicity of a lengthy document and a very technical document. We're in the phase 4, which is strategic directions, and just finishing that phase. We met, for those who are on the committee last term, we met with the committee and presented the background discussion papers. We have a number of background discussion papers that were done, including an overall summary report. This report takes that summary report and what was identified in those background papers and identifies, basically sets out the outline of the new zoning bylaw, sets out the various chapters of the new zoning bylaw, and sets what's going to be in those chapters. The summary report identified a number of options. This report reviews those options and makes recommendations. So this is really a recommendation for how, at a high level, how to carry forward and create the zoning bylaw. It sets out the whole, almost like a recipe for preparing that zoning bylaw. We have a PIC tonight, which will be our PIC on this phase. We can be virtual now because of the storm. And then our next phase is writing that comprehensive zoning bylaw. We've already actually started writing that, are well along on that. And then we'll be coming back to you with that first draft, and to a PIC number 3 on that first draft. Then our final phase is the actual formal public consultation on the comprehensive zoning bylaw, and finalizing various phases of that. So the report before you sets out, these are all the various sections of the report, and these will be the sections that you'll see in the zoning bylaw. Generally in this order, we believe. We'll set out those, and I'm going to go through each one of these and just really high level of what's each of the sections of this report set out. So the first thing we were going to be looking at putting in the zoning bylaw right at the front, right to start, is for the general public. How do I read this? What is typically a very complicated, very technical document? How do I get through it? How do I find what's permitted on my property? How do I find what I can do on my property if I want to make some changes? So it sets out the process. It's how to read the zoning maps, how to find the applicable provisions, and it really sets out a step-by-step guide for the public to figure out what they need to look at to figure out what's on their property. We're going to have, as we get through it, we're going to have lots of graphics to help them along. So try and make it as user-friendly as possible for this document. Our next chapter is the administrative section. Each bylaw has an administrative section, and it will describe how the bylaw is interpreted and how it will be implemented. Many of the provisions are going to be carried forward from the city's current zoning bylaw, but we also, when we've gone through all the background studies, we looked not only at the city's current zoning bylaw, but we looked at Brant County zoning bylaw, because a portion of the city now had the boundary adjustment lands. And so in those boundary adjustment lands, the Brant County zoning bylaws currently apply. So really there's 2 zoning bylaws apply right now in the city. So we've looked at both of those, and we've identified a number of sections we're going to carry forward. We've also, through a best practice review, identified a number of other sections that we're going to add to the administrative section to really help inform how to interpret the bylaw. Chapter 4 is general provisions. This is one of the biggest sections in zoning bylaws, and it sets out standards that apply across the municipality to all zones, and they can be quite topic specific or quite general. And what we've done is we created in the report, we've created a table of these with a short summary of them. So you see, for instance, starting with just the top of the table, we just got an example here, additional residential units. So sometimes used to be called secondary suites or accessory dwelling units. And we call them additional dwelling residential units because the province says you now can have up to 3 units in a single semi or townhouse unit. But there's other things, bed and breakfasts, which would apply across commercial patios, buffering aspects. There's many more. This is probably going to be this and definition section will be the largest sections in the bylaw. Like it's the next section is the definition section. So the definition section, we've got a list in this report. This lists all the likely ones, terms that we're going to define. And they're taken from, some of them are taken from, as I said, the Brantford zoning bylaw, the existing one, and some from the Brant County zoning bylaw. And we looked at, in the background report, we looked at all of those definitions and we made recommendations, some that we're going to keep, some we're going to get rid of, we don't need anymore, and some that we don't know until we finalize the bylaw. So when we get into all the permitted uses, some of these may drop off. For instance, the old theories and bylaws were, well, let's define a clothing store, a jewelry store, and a bookstore. Well, those are all retail stores. Can we just have one definition of retail store? So unless we need to define something differently, we need to have different provisions for it, it'll all become in one. So we're really trying to simplify the bylaw and get rid of a lot of the definitions. The next section will be parking and loading. So in the current zoning bylaw, this is encompassed in the general provisions. We're pulling it out as a separate section. We believe that's important. And we've updated, and there's a table 2 in the bylaw that has all our suggested parking rates for all the different uses. We've tried to be consistent in that the old zoning bylaw, many of the old zoning bylaws had, whereas a use that's more of an open facility, like a community hall, place of worship, used to be by the amount of people that can accommodate, or by pew spaces, or by number of seats. Those are really hard for the bylaw enforcement people and the zoning people to interpret. So we're trying to change those all to gross floor area. So when the zoning folks get an application in, they can easily see, okay, this is a gross floor area, this is how many parking space we need, rather than trying to interpret how many people could occupy the space or how many chairs you can get into it. We've simplified a number of the parking provisions. So where there's similar uses, we've tried to use the same parking standard. We've also looked at best practices for a number of new zoning bylaws, have done parking studies and looked at those provisions. Coming out of the last meeting we had with the task force and the planning advisory committee was a desire for the staff to look more detail at apartment and block townhouse parking requirements. So staff have undertaken a parking utilization study. And we have staff here today that have looked at it, but it was a very extensive study that was undertaken. Case studies of 11 apartment buildings, 3 block townhouses. And what they did was they looked at the occupied spaces at different times of the day and different days, and looked at, see what actually number of spaces per unit are being used. Staff already also did a survey of property managers with 37 apartment buildings, 10 block townhouses, and they came up with an average parking utilization rate for the different types of housing. And you can see that the recommendation is in the table. And what they found was that there's a lower requirement in the downtown urban growth center for apartment buildings. There's also a lower requirement for affordable housing, and overall, a generally lower requirement than the current bylaw provides for. So the recommendations, as seen in table 7 on the slide here, which is in the report, are different rates for affordable housing, apartment, which is 1 space per plus a visitor. We don't currently have visitors, so we're adding visitor parking requirement. Block townhouse slightly higher. Stacked townhouse is the same as a block townhouse with 1 and plus 0.25. Mixed use building would be the similar as a standard apartment building. And then any retail, office, non-residential would be whatever that rate is for those types of uses. And then you can see that in the downtown 0.7 plus 0.15, so 0.85 overall. So that's lower, and the lowest is for affordable housing at the top, which would be 0.65 total with visitor and unit spaces. There's a number of other parking and loading standards that are we're proposing in the bylaw. These addressing various aspects. Many of them are already addressed in your zoning bylaw. Some of them are new standards, like bicycle parking rates for commercial multi-unit residential buildings, requirements for vehicle charging spaces, updating the storage of recreational vehicles to make it a little bit more enforceable. Right now, it's difficult to enforce those provisions. We're also, because of the changes in the Planning Act and units of less than 10 units can't go through site plan. We're keeping some provisions that you can be implemented through the zoning bylaw that you couldn't through the site plan, such as surface parking requirements. And also, we're addressing loading space requirements, drive-through and stacking requirements for drive-throughs. And the official plan sets out prohibitions for parking garages on some of the retail main streets. So we're reflecting that in the zoning bylaw. So then we get into bylaw gets into all the various zones. And we start with the mixed use zones. For those that were at the last meeting, you recall that the structure of the bylaw is set up so it's going to basically mimic the designations in the official plan. So it's easy for the public to understand. You got a historic Main Street designation, there's going to be a matching historic Main Street zone. So we've broken up the mixed use zones into 6 zones. 3 of those are in the downtown, the historic Main Street, lower downtown, upper downtown. Then we have the major commercial, which is, you see those as the major plazas and malls in the city. Those are going to be a mixed use zone. Then we have the intensification corridors in the official plan, and there's really 2. We have an overall intensification corridor zone, and then Brant Heritage Conservation District is a bit different because there's a Heritage Conservation District plan on Brant Street. And so there's different provisions in order to match what's in that plan. Then what you'll see is what we do is we have a table of permitted uses, and we have that for every zone, and we have the uses along the side, the zones along the top, and then the yeses tell us what uses are permitted in that. We're also going to have many of typical lot provisions, but we're also, because we're in some of these zones are a little bit higher density, we're going to introduce minimum ground floor height for commercial uses, minimum balcony depth, amenity space requirements and we're going to have that similar in the high density zones as well. In terms of looking at maximum height, we're setting up recommended heights for each of the zones, recognizing this is the maximum height, and it may be lower height depending on compatibility with adjacent development, particularly low density development. So they'll be subject to angular planes and transition requirements that you may not, as a landlord, be able to meet those maximum heights because you have to meet these performance requirements. So in the historic Main Street, and these some of these heights come right out of the official plan, others are silent on it, and we've identified recommended heights. So we have the Main Street of up to 6 stories, the lower downtown of up to 24 stories. So this is the highest densities is in the lower downtown. Upper downtown, we maximum 6 stories. The major commercial zone up to 18 stories. The Brant Avenue Heritage Conservation District is maximum 3 stories. So that's coming out of the HCD and the official plan. And then we have intensification corridor. And a little bit different on Erie Avenue is up to 6 stories. That comes out of the official plan. Other corridors up to maximum of 12 stories. And then again, subject to transitional provisions. Additional provisions that will apply, including a podium height. So where you have a building with a tower sitting on a building, there's going to be a requirement for a podium. So a low rise component to the building, then the towers will be set back from that. So there's podium height requirements. Then there's a step back from the podium required for any towers. So these are bigger than a mid-rise building. So bigger than 6 stories, you're going to have, they'll get into a tower set requirement. There are a maximum tower floor plate, typically requires 750 square meters. So that keeps the towers fairly small, allows limits the shadow caused by towers. And then angular plane requirement. Usually what we apply is a 45-degree angular plane from a low-rise residential area to make sure that building steps back from lower density buildings. And a lot of these are set out in the Brantford Urban Design Manual. We'll be reflecting those requirements in the Brantford Urban Design Manual. So then we get into the residential zones. Again, these reflect generally the designations in the official plan. We start off with the lowest density. It's the suburban residential zone, which is reflecting the areas in Tootle Heights that are unserviced. So these are large lot, private servicing lots. Then we have the existing neighborhood low-rise zone, which is all the existing built areas in Brantford. And then for the new areas, the new greenfield areas, so these would be part of the boundary adjustment lands to north of Power Line Road, and a few other areas will be the greenfield neighborhood low-rise, which is going to allow a broader range of housing. Then we have the neighborhood corridor, which is generally in that land north of Power Line Road, and a couple other areas where we have higher density neighborhood corridor. And then we have residential mid-rise and residential high-rise. Again, we have a table of permitted uses, and there's going to be additional specific considerations in some areas for different heights. Let me get into a few of those. So the suburban residential zone, as I indicated, is primarily the non-serviced lands on private septics, large lots, minimum lot area of 4,000 square meters, which is basically an acre, and a lot frontage of 24 meters. Existing low-rise zone will permit semi-detached, singles, duplex, triplex, basically a maximum height of 3 stories. Greenfield neighborhood low-rise zone, that's the new greenfield areas. We're going to permit a little bit broader range of uses, including street townhouses, and again, 3-story maximum height. And the neighborhood commercial zone, in this you'll have a broad range of housing forms, including low-rise apartments, low and mid-rise apartments, and neighborhood supporting uses. So, your typical things you find in neighborhood and retail, personal service, restaurants would be permitted in along that corridor, up to 6 stories. Except that there's an area around Toodle Heights that has a neighborhood corridor, and its maximum height will be 4 stories. Then we have the mid-rise zone, and these are really the medium density zones that are currently in your bylaw. Maximum height would be 6 stories for new sites, but a number of them are already zoned in your zoning bylaw, and they're maximum 4 stories. So we're going to keep those for the existing site of maximum 4 stories. And then the residential high-rise permit both residential and some neighborhood supporting uses on the ground floor with a height of maximum height of 12 stories. We have 2 institutional zones proposing a major institutional zone and a minor institutional zone. Basically, it's self-explanatory. The larger uses, such as hospital, high school, secondary schools, universities will be under the major institutional zone, and those smaller uses, elementary schools, medical offices, daycare facilities will be under the minor institutional zone, although some are permitted in both. And because these institutional uses are very different in nature, we're going to have different lot and yard provisions for each type of institutional use. So you'll have schools will have a different lot and yard requirements from, for instance, a place of worship. Our next zone is our employment zones, and we'll have, reflecting the official plan, we have 2 employment zones, general employment and the prestige employment zones. Again, the typical lot and yard provisions that were currently in the zoning bylaw will be carried forward, although we're going to get rid of the maximum coverage requirement. What we want to do is maximize the most amount of employment you can get on a site and really provide for landscape requirements, and it's going to be parking. It also dictates the coverage. And often the case for industries, it's the parking requirements, their own parking requirements, rather than the zoning bylaw's parking requirements will dictate the amount that's covered on site. And of course, we'll be implementing the urban design manual in those zone provisions. Then we get into commercial zones. So all major commercial areas are going to be mixed use, but there's some that are commercial zones that will be in the neighborhoods, and these are the smaller commercial zones. Although we've also separated out the automobile gas station, service station into a separate zone because they have different provisions. It's currently a separate zone in your zoning bylaw. And so you might find those in the intensification corridors in the commercial areas in the neighborhoods. Those will be a separate zone. Then we'll have convenience commercial zone. And so these are the really small sites that you find in the interior of a residential neighborhood. And then you have a neighborhood commercial zone, which are a bit larger, the plaza sites, basically, the grocery store plaza sites that you see in the middle of a neighborhood. Those would be a separate zone. They, though, will allow mixed use up to 4 stories and have separate provisions if they're mixed use versus sole commercial uses. And then we'll have one agricultural zone to reflect those areas that came in through the boundary adjustment that aren't in the urban boundary. We will have different provisions for farms versus rural residential lots because they have different requirements, as well as greenhouses or farm production facilities. We also have to apply the minimum distance separation requirements for separating from a livestock facility. So we'll have those requirements in the bylaw. I should say that under Brant County's zoning bylaw, it had 2 different agricultural zones. We feel for just the area we're dealing with, it's just one agricultural zone is sufficient. And then we're almost getting to the end. We have a core natural zone, which is the natural heritage facility, the facilities that will be incorporated in this zone and reflect what's in the official plan, be similar to that designation. The zone, which is unique to this zone, many cases the zones follow property lines, but because the natural features don't follow property lines, they'll divide property lines. It'll be a bit different in terms of the boundaries. We won't be setting out generally provisions, lot and yard provisions, because really it is what's there on the site dictates what falls on the site. And in most cases, other than some cemeteries and parks that exist, there'll be very few buildings or structures permitted on the land. Then we have one open space zone. We implement the parks and open space designation. We'll also identify those. There's a number of significant archaeological sites that we're going to zone as open space, so the development can happen with them, with a site-specific provision to prohibit erection of buildings. But we're not going to flag them as archaeological because they're significant. But we'll just have a site-specific that says buildings and structures aren't permitted. We'll have typical lot and yard provisions, although the number of them will not apply except for those where we have to have a building, and we'll have separate provisions for cemeteries and golf courses. And then our last zone is a development zone. So development zone is basically an interim zone, and this will apply to the residential community areas in the boundary expansion areas. And the reason for it is because we don't know exactly where the zones go until the developers come forward with their draft plans. So where the schools go, where the parks go, where do the specific boundaries of the residential and corridors go. So we'll have a development zone that basically is interim until they come forward with their draft plans and come forward with a zoning amendment that sits the specific zones in place. Basically, when it will happen when they do their block plans and their draft plans. It basically will permit only existing uses that are existing at the date the zoning bylaw comes into effect will be permitted. So next steps indicated, our next step is to prepare the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw. As the zoning bylaw progresses, there may need to be changes to what we've set out here. This is our first cut at it, and we get into the detail. There may be changes. We're already starting to see. We're working through the general provisions. We're starting to identify some changes to those general provisions that we had flagged in this report, but generally pretty similar. We have a PIC tonight, and then we have the COW presentation on March 21st. So that finishes the overview.
Thank you very much. There were no questions that came up during it. Our next item for consideration is the actual report that includes this. My suggestion would be that we move As were no questions, we move on, take the questions and discussion there.
Can we ask questions?
Yes, we can.
Try my first.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Paul.
Okay.
My name is Jan Kanai. I listened to the details of every part you explained. When the study was done for parking, how many parking is supposed to be for each building? Did they do the study at different times of the day, different days of the week?
Yes, and I'll let staff who are working on that respond to that.
Yeah, Jeff Cornwell, Project Manager of Development Transportation. We counted 14 sites. And we basically did the studies all different hours, all different days. So our highest ratios were in the middle of the night. So we found the highest parking usually between 11 PM and 4 AM. So yeah, we certainly were out in the middle of the night. And we did 10 studies for each location. So we did a total of 140 observations.
Did they also check the width of each parking spot?
No, certainly newer developments have to conform to our current bylaw, but there's a lot of older parking lots. Some of them don't even have spaces marked because they're worn down, et cetera. So we tried our best to figure out exactly how many spaces were there. So in most cases, we have the exact number. Some were estimates because we can't tell exactly how the spots were demarcated. And then other spots, people were parking in gravel areas and et cetera, that they weren't clearly identified.
One more question. On the M2 zoning, is there any way the council can restrict some of the uses there? For example, the recycling, pet food manufacturing. It causes a lot of grief for the people around in the residential.
For, you mean grief because of the noise, odors?
No, the order.
Yeah, yeah. So we, in zoning bylaw can prohibit noxious uses or require separation distance from noxious uses. The province has separation guidelines. So we can certainly look into that about applying those separation guidelines, which separate, basically sets out 3 categories of uses, industrial uses, class 1, 2, and 3 types of uses, and sets out different separation requirements. So we could look at that, or if there, we also have a requirement if there are actually noxious uses, then they wouldn't be permitted. So we can look at both of those.
Yeah, I think it's very important because in an M2 zoning, it is allowed that they can manufacture.
Yes, broad range of manufacturing.
But a few years later, there's a residential subdivision right beside it. So, and it creates a lot of problems for them.
Yeah, understood.
Mr. Chairman, Joe Muno, Manager of Development Planning, if I could just add to Mr. Lowe's response. So for Member Penang, the current M2 zones that exist within the city, a lot of them were developed pre-2018, which did not subject the M2 zone to specific site plan requirements. And that is why there are some of those uses that exist today that have never have been looked at in more detail with respect to noise, vibration, odor. Those have since 2018 now been included in our site plan control manual or bylaw, I should say. And that then subjects the development or the proposed developments to the requirements of site plan control, which include specific review requirements such as studies for noise, for vibration in certain instances, depending on what production or manufacturing is occurring in those M2 zones. And then, as Paul has suggested, the new employment lands or the employment designations within the new official plan are more modernized, and that's what this bylaw will do. It will modernize the current zones to follow suit with those existing or those new existing designations.
Is it possible that the M2 zoning could be on the east side or on the north side where the wind doesn't come from? Mostly it's westerly wind.
Right,
when they consider which side should be the M2 zoning industrial sector, is it possible that they look into the wind cycle?
I will just, Mr. Chairman, just briefly before members of staff or Paul speak to it, is it unfortunate with respect to even going through a site plan control bylaw or site plan control process. The ministry requirements when it comes down to noise and vibration and odor don't really factor in prevailing winds. That's probably one of the issues. And I know that the ministry at some point in the last couple of years was looking at updating the early 1992, 94 guidelines, but have not done that. They basically had moved away with the works that they had started a couple years back with regards to updating those manuals or guidelines. And I mean, I will leave it at that. And I know that some of those current M2 zones will no longer be in play in the sense of where the new employment lands or designations have been updated through the municipal comprehensive review process that Paul and his group had done on behalf of the city in establishing the new designations through the official plan.
Last question. In the mixed use zones or commercial zoning, are they considering that the residential in some of the cities like Burlington, Oakville, they are allowing some residential units on top of the commercial, like the old downtown to the mama papa.
yes, absolutely.
Kind of with a shortage of homes, is the city considering anything like that?
So that would be permitted under the zoning bylaw.
We did.
Yeah, that's the intent. All those mixed use areas.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Your question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in reference to the parking, there's some very specific and different requirements depending on the type of commercial use. There could be one space per 10 meters square, one per 30 meters square. And I really wasn't part of the study looking at commercial uses. So where did that information come from? How were those decisions made?
So some of them were from the existing zoning bylaw, and others, we went through in the background report, we went through all the existing provisions, and then we compared that to best practices and what other municipalities were doing, what we're finding.
Right.
I think in the retail, we basically kept what you had, which seemed to be a little bit less restrictive in a lot of other municipalities, but we kept what you already have. But in many of those cases, it's either what you have or a slight change. The biggest change were all of the ones that weren't by gross floor area. We changed those to a gross floor area number.
Okay. And then switching over to residential. So you have in here, there's a space per unit and there's a space for visitors. So you add them together to get the total parking requirement for that program.
Right, so it's a space per unit and a visitor space per unit. Yeah.
And you're doing that because you want a builder to specifically designate visitor parking.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. So how do you deal with, I see fourplex is one space per unit plus 0.15 space per unit for visitors. So that gives like 1 point. So let's say you have 4 units. How do you do it? How do you do a sixth of the parking space? The 6/10 of the parking space?
Yeah, through the chair, so you have to round up. So in the zoning bylaw, that's how it works. If you ever have a fraction of a space, you have to round up to the next full space. So if you had one fourplex, you're gonna end up with one visitor parking space, not 0.5 in this.
Okay. All right. And so when you're doing that rounding up, say for apartment buildings, if it's, let's say it's 22.4, you round down or round up? As soon as it's 222.1, we round up.
Yep.
Okay, all right. Then my next question is, it says drive-through and stacking rates. I don't understand that. What?
The stacking rates is a term we use for drive-through. Is basically how many spots are in line before you get to that, the talk box. And we also usually have a requirement for how many between your pickup window and your talk box. So you might have 3 in between, and then you have a series lining up before you get there.
Right, so I noticed that it's 13, the stacking rates for restaurants.
Yes,
So does that mean like, so for example, at Tim Hortons drive-through, which have to show that there's enough room for 13 cars to be stacked up before they get to the
yes,
speaker?
yes. And they'd be showing that in the site plan.
Okay, and if they only have room for 8, so it's a site plan amendment or is it?
Well, they'd have to have a minor variance.
Minor variance, okay. All right. You mentioned respect to prohibiting parking lots in Fisher Plan's historic Main Street precinct, and it is talking about restricting direct access or the parking area fronting directly onto the road.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right.
It says on Brand Ave, or the Brand Ave Heritage District Conservation District, that might be considered. So did you consider that? I mean, those kinds of parking lots, like you see them in Toronto all the time, and they're designed to encourage customers of the retail establishments. They see it, you know, oh, good, I can park there, right? Because you're tucking the parking behind buildings, customers don't see it, they don't use it.
Right.
Right, and Brand Ave, I could see at some point perhaps having to eliminate parking entirely on street and having to rely entirely on these kinds of parkettes. So given that that is maybe where Brand Ave goes, do you think that makes sense?
We'll have to look at, this is a direction from the official plan to look at that. So if that's an issue, then we'll have to look at, particularly if there's on-street parking is going to be eliminated. That's really tough on a main street.
Yeah. What's done in Toronto all the time. Yeah.
Very
well,
different, yeah.
I mean, there can be reasons why we have to go there, right?
Yeah.
Which has to do with traffic flows and trying to avoid gridlock, but flipping into the permitted uses in various zones, and maybe this will alleviate my concerns, but where is the upper downtown? What are the boundaries of the upper downtown?
It's set out in the official plan. I'd have to look at the schedule. I don't know if we can pull that up, Victoria.
It's essentially up to
The train
the
station
train station,
on West Street,
up at Gray and West. It's not that far. And
Clarence. So like the BIA, kind of the BIA.
it's
A little bit broader than
north of the BIA.
Yeah.
So it's kind of from West over to Clarence, from maybe it's Bloomington up to Gray, more or less.
Include some residential areas.
Where does it start on the, where's the southerly boundary? Is that Dalhousie or Colburn or?
Just north
No,
of.
the historic main streets are along Dalhousie, Culver.
Yeah.
So it's north of those. I just can't remember if it's Darwin,
So it starts at Darling then
the
up.
next one up. Yeah,
Okay. And this area here, Dalhousie and Colburn, is that lower downtown or? is
No,
that-
that's
the
Main
historic
Street.
main streets,
Okay.
and then the lower is,
So what's the height restriction on historic main streets?
6 stories.
All right, does that make sense on Colburn and Dalhousie Street, 6 stories? I mean, why wouldn't you have 12 or 20? The lower downtown is 24, right?
Right.
Isn't that where you want high rise?
We definitely want high rise in the lower downtown. That was the official plan set up. That's where the most density would be. But the idea was to have a more mid-rise along the main street. So that was the
Why?
6 stories, the main street. Just bring it down a little bit. Have more of a walkable presence along that main street. The properties are quite shallow. So that was the objective, was to look at more of a mid-rise format along those streets.
it's more of a design objective to maintain the historic streetscape with, you know, and it's generally a 3-story streetscape, and then still allow for some height, stepped back a little bit, you know, going up to 6 stories, but not to go much beyond that to consider shadow.
I see
and
8
whatnot.
stories over there. I just question that, given maybe 12's out of line with the streetscape, but it is the heart of our city, and don't you generally want?
You do, and that's why, I mean, we're looked at, the real intensification would be in the lower downtown, which is right adjacent to the downtown. That's where you get the most intense. You're gonna get, if you go to that type of height on Dalhousie and Colburn, you're gonna get more of a canyon effect. Whereas if you keep it more of a mid-rise site, you don't get that canyon effect. You're still gonna have a quite comfortable pedestrian environment in that area.
All right, but so if you have 24 stories, that's what this says, 24 in the lower downtown.
Yeah.
Like, will they tower above the 6 stories up here in Colburn?
Yes, yeah. It'd be tall, for sure, it'd be taller. There, you're gonna see that at higher height in that lower downtown.
There's the elevation change as well.
There is, but a couple of
They
stories.
will be. It will be
Yeah.
Well, what about the end here, Colburn and Deluzee, like say near the river, maybe something of the order of 10 to 12 would be considered attractive because of the river and views under the river. Maybe you got to do it that how to make it economic. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, we, on the other side of Grant Avenue, it is a higher, it would be a higher height, right? That's part of the upper downtown. Oh, that's those 6 stories. Yeah. I mean, something you could look at.
I mean, the part of the challenge, I think, in the Colburn and Deluzee is the economics of doing development. They're a small footprint, even when it's 6 stories, may not generate enough.
You're good. Your issue there is gonna be parking. And so on small sites, may try to accommodate the underground parking. That's gonna be the issue.
All right, but every story you put on a building, it increases the economic viability of it.
It does, but there's a limit on how deep you can go on a cost feasibility basis. Right, going down 6, 7, 8 stories on underground parking is just gonna be cost prohibitive.
Well, it'd be interesting. Now, going into use permitted in residential zones, you've got duplex dwellings now in suburban residential zones. Doesn't the recent change of the Planning Act allow for duplexes?
Not on where you have private services.
Or private services?
Yeah, because the suburban is just private services, septic. So we have a septic, those provincial requirements don't apply.
So the existing neighborhood low rise, that would be serviced
Yes.
single family,
Yes.
what was in the past single
Yes.
family.
That's suburban residential, so it's really just
Yeah,
limited
there's-
to.
It's basically Tudor Heights. Yes, it's Tudor Heights.
We didn't have that.
Okay.
We wouldn't even have that, so.
All right, well, that answers a lot of my questions. And, looking at the permitted uses for employment zones. So I'm looking at from the general employment to prestige employment. And daycare facilities not permitted in general employment zones. Does that make sense? A lot of employers now are trying to provide on-site daycare or to increase their attractiveness to prospective employees.
It's all because of the compatibility requirements of the PPS, the D6 guidelines. And the PPS requires you to look at when you have a sensitive land use, which a daycare would be a sensitive land use, then you'd have to have separation distance restrictions on the industrial uses that are near a daycare facility. So it really is all about that compatibility requirement. So that's why we've got them in the prestige, but not in the general employment.
Okay, general office, why isn't that the same reason in the general employment?
I'd have to look at the official plan if we made any differences on that, did we?
Yes, so through the official plan, the general employment designation only has ancillary offices, so like a office that is secondary to another industrial use, whereas that prestige designation allows for.
Standalone office.
Okay, so we'll go it this way, what would be considered prestige?
So prestige is a separate designation. It's generally like the areas near the 403 that are higher visibility are the prestige employment designations. So there's less of those uses that might have those compatibility impacts in this area.
I think of employment areas, let's say closer to Toronto, let's say it's in Burlington, Mississauga, Milton. You'll see office development in what would not meet your definition of prestige. And
Most of
It's
those,
also along the arterial roads, though, not just the 403 frontage, so.
most of those areas you'll see through Milton and Oakville are all prestige where you see those major offices. So those would be prestige employment areas. In general employment area, you rarely see a major office unless it's attached to an industry. So it's associated with that industry. They might have an associated office, associated part of the building, but rarely would you see in a general employment area.
So what would be considered ancillary?
Ancillary, anything related to that industry. So that industry is manufacturing widgets there. They got their office, even if it's their Canadian office, that's okay, that's permitted.
So it could be, they set up a distribution plant here, they like it so much, they want to move the Canadian head office there.
Yeah,
Will this prevent them from doing that, or can they do that?
they can do that.
Okay,
Okay.
those are my questions. Thank you.
There's questions from committee members, remote.
Next week, Councillor Hunt, and then looking into Holder.
I'm sorry,
Councillor Hunt?
Councillor Hunt.
Yes, my question is around, I guess it would be large commercial parking. We currently have a ratio, number of spaces and how many accessible spaces need to be designated. Is this the opportunity when we're, doing this new zoning bylaw to look at increasing that ratio? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 50, which is in most large commercial parking spaces is not sufficient by any stretch of the imagination. So I know that there have been changes in other municipalities to increase that ratio. And I'm hoping that this is our opportunity in Brantford to increase that ratio as we're looking at this new zoning bylaw.
To your simple answer, yes, this is the time for us to look at it, because this is where we put it in as a zoning bylaw. So, and I can't remember if we made changes. Do you remember?
We are
Victoria?
gonna we're proposing to make some changes to better reflect the AODA requirements, the Design of Public Spaces standards. So currently I think we have it as it's not exactly word for word the way that the Act has it. So we're proposing to just be consistent with what the Act has.
That would be in our background part report.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was involved in a study and we looked at the ratio of drivers versus the number of accessible parking permits that are issued in the province, which is well above 1 to 50. And so the current ratio is certainly not sufficient. So if this is the opportunity to increase that ratio, then I'd certainly like to see that, and not being involved prior to this term. I'm kind of not sure where this fits in, but if now's the time to introduce that discussion, I would think that we should do that.
Certainly, we can look at that.
Our current ratio is actually 4% of a parking lot, unless it has more than 200 spaces, then it's down to 2% plus 2 for commercial lots.
So
And
regardless,
it's in a residential area.
oh, okay, so I'm thinking in terms of think large parking spots. So think going to Zehrs on Fairview, the Walmart Plaza, those types of spots. The ratio is nowhere near sufficient. I think for the size of the Walmart parking lot, you've got like 6 spaces in front of Walmart versus several hundred spaces in the parking. So I think I realize, so that's residential, which is great, but if this is the place to introduce the large commercial parking ratio, then I think this is a good time to look at that.
We can certainly look at what others done, what the standard is across the province for other bylaws, and see how it compares in Brantford.
Yeah, the other thing to consider also, and this is personally, but there are accessible spots, and then there are van accessible spots, which is the requirement for the access aisle between the accessible spots.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And also,
Linda Holder.
I'm sorry,
Linda Holder.
Linda?
Hi. I was wondering regarding the parking spaces. It was made mention that downtown there was less needed, and also with some of the lower income areas, less were needed. To me, that reflects on the walkable score as well as public transportation. Was public transportation for these new developments taken into effect?
I would say yes. Almost all of the units and apartments we counted were all on transit routes or very close walk to them. We did also classify them how far away they are to the highway, how far away they were from the downtown, just to try to see if there was any patterns. But we did generally find that the units that were closer to the downtown or commercial developments had less requirement for parking.
And is there a zone in law for how close that bus stop is to the apartment buildings or industrial sites for accessibility again?
No, Brantford Transit has a general rule of thumb when putting in new bus routes, especially through newer subdivisions, how far away they can be from each dwelling. But there isn't really anything to control anything that's there existing. But transit certainly looks at any larger developments as a good opportunity to increase ridership. So they would want to put a stop within close proximity.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mark. I was thinking about I'm back to the height requirement. And what do you do with overlay? Like, I was thinking of, we were talking about the upper downtown. And of course, we have Market Street North. And there are, I suspect, builders or developers that are interested because of the location of the train station, creating buildings that would cater a large degree to commuters. And they would want more than 6, I'm sure. So what would apply there? Would it be 12 because it's a major artery, or would it be 6 because it's part of upper downtown? How would that work?
And we're just looking at the map.
Still upper downtown, which is 6. Yeah, upper downtown's 6, which goes up along Market Street and George Street to Durham Street. And West Street is not a transportation corridor. Oh, yeah. This is there.
Yeah, it'd be the 6 stories.
Okay, you seriously got to think about that because we've already approved one with the old Brown clothing store, which I think was 9 stories.
10, yeah.
10.
Okay.
And there's really no streetscape on Market Street
Oh.
to speak of, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think we need to consider that. I think 6 would be unduly restrictive to that area.
Okay.
You know, we certainly want to encourage that area to redevelop and probably redevelop in probably a higher density residential because of the fact that there's the train station right next door.
Sure, we look at that.
Okay. And have you given any thought to some counselors will say that, so for example, it's a crisis residence or it's a lodging house, that their ward or their particular neighborhood already has enough of those. Have you thought about delineating the city into areas that already have a very high percentage of, say, boarding homes or crisis residents and modifying what's allowed in those areas?
That is, in previous bylaws, has been struck down by the courts. Separating distances for those type of facilities.
I'm not about separating, I'm talking about just not allowing them.
Yeah, it would still be getting in that same area. And your council's, that's council's desire, we could look at it, but with the caveat that there could be issues about.
Well, you're already doing it for suburban residential areas and.
Well, the suburban residential areas is because it's on septics.
Okay. But I'm looking at, okay, if I look at the existing neighborhood low rise,
Yeah,
that's the group homes allowed. Well, no, group homes not allowed in existing neighborhood low rise.
a group correctional home is,
So why would you allow a group correctional home in
Not a
existing
group
neighborhood
home.
low rise and not a group home?
is it the size? I don't know, might be. I wouldn't, we'll have to look at it at that because it doesn't make sense. I would say the group home would be permitted in both of those.
And
Okay, that's the size.
No, I think it should be the build form that's permitted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so-
okay, and going back to the upper downtown zone. See nightclub, bar and pub, no. Not allowed. I would suggest for the same reason I talked about Market Street North, that doesn't make sense. And especially if it begins on Darling Street. Really would want to say that you can't put a pub or bar on Darling Street.
Yeah, we can look at that.
Yeah.
So we get rid of that.
Yeah,
I understand maybe if it's 3 streets over.
Yeah.
You know, if you get beyond Nelson and those residential area, that might. not make sense.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not so much the designation problem, it's just the delineation of the zone.
yeah, because we do have some residential areas in that zone, so.
Some nuanced consideration along Market Street.
Yeah, we could have a kind of a subzone along there that brings out where the retail Main Street is, where the retail area more is.
Okay, I've got a few questions and comments. I guess the first one is, in the user guide, is that the right place to generally put how to request a zoning bylaw amendment request?
Yeah, it's a good idea. I saw your comment, and I think that's a really good idea. We could put that in.
Okay. And in general provisions, something triggered as I was looking at one of the things that they defined a food service vehicle. And it came up in my mind, what's the difference in when a vehicle is not a vehicle anymore? So food service vehicle, in my mind, is movable, has wheels attached, can be moved. What happens when the wheels get taken off? Does it become a permanent structure?
And bylaws I've seen often, the definition will say whether the wheels are removed or not, it's still that entity. Because you do see the chip trucks and they become a
Yes.
permanent fixture. Still wouldn't be considered a building, so it'd still be considered that food truck vehicle. So whether it's on blocks or not on blocks, it'd still be the same.
And then a question also in general provisions around hazardous uses. We define, are asking, suggesting there that the hazardous use would be not permitted. But in some cases, there are things that we can identify as being hazardous that are legally permitted. So for instance, tobacco. So the manufacturer of cigarettes, it would be, by the definition proposed, it would actually be a hazardous use because you're creating something that, while it's legal, it's a health risk. So does there need to be nuance in that description?
See, the determination of hazard has to be the land use and not the product,
Okay,
right? So
Okay.
cigarettes are a product, but the
Yep.
land use of manufacturing it wouldn't be hazardous. So you have to look at, for that determination, it's got to be the land use.
in the parking and loading section in particular, but I think it happened in some other places as well. Rather than using the word recommended, you used proposed. Is that just a nuance? Are the terms interchangeable within the report, or?
Generally, I mean, we're not to.
That's more of a question to staff more than anything else.
Yeah, this report is not to the final recommendation that will be in the zoning bylaw.
Okay.
That would be what we'll be recommending to council for for approval.
Okay. So those are my questions. Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Chair, you asked a very good question, which triggered something in my mind. We know that there is a production process in town where there have been 2 big fires the last 3 years. And there was some talk about, can you address that through zoning? And I heard what you said, which is you don't zone for the product you produce. But you're not, and should you not, be defining certain industrial uses that maybe you just don't want because they're too risky.
Yeah, you can have a list of prohibited uses. Many municipalities have that. So those that are risky, you can prohibit them.
All right, and has that been considered? I know we've asked, council asked for a report on that particular incident and what recommendations might be made following further information we obtained from the fire department and the fire marshal's office. Is that considered in this, or is it to be considered when we get that report?
It's to be considered. We're gonna be talking with the fire department. And other side of special setbacks that might need to be in place for storage.
And there's another industrial production that we've had problems with, and that's cannabis. And there's one in particular down in Ward, it's Ward 4, I believe it is, yeah. This is Ward 5. Anyways, it was licensed under that, where you can assign the person, 75.
Yep.
Yeah, so they're subject to fewer restrictions than the more professional, larger operations. Can you prohibit those?
You can prohibit, you can prohibit wherever you want the cannabis facilities. Where it becomes a little bit dicier is in your agriculture area because it's an agriculture use. So it's very difficult to prohibit it. Many municipalities are prohibiting it outdoor, but still allowing it indoor in the agriculture areas but since it's an agriculture use, you generally have to permit it in some fashion there. You can have setbacks from residential areas. You can require it to be indoors in agriculture areas. But in your industrial areas, you can certainly prohibit it because you're not generally allowing or permitting an agriculture use in your industrial areas.
Well, and this would be an industrial area that's right in the heart of our city.
Right.
And creating all kinds of odor issues.
Yeah.
And then I toured a facility in Paris, which is a medical cannabis facility, like state of the art, and there were no odors because it operates at a very high level. Can you distinguish then between different kinds of cannabis operators? Allow one but prohibit the other?
Yeah, that would be more difficult. You can set requirements, and we've done this for other municipalities, setting requirements for the odor control and requiring them to go through site plan and confirming the odor control facilities, but you can do that. And you're absolutely right. It's usually the smaller facilities that are more problematic. The bigger facilities have the money to put in the odor control and they can do it, and you don't have problems with them.
Yeah, and what we've tried to do is we've created a sort of a site-specific zoning bylaw, which has a separation.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But that may not be enough. Right.
Absolutely. If the odor control is not working, it won't be enough.
So I'd ask if you'd consider whether we should do something similar to what I was talking about in terms of certain hazardous manufacturing operations. If we should do something similar to certain types of cannabis operators. I don't know how to do it, but I think it's worth, this would be the time to do it.
Or if they're noxious.
We could maybe prohibit them in certain areas of the city.
Yeah, we can look at all that.
You know, for example, our new employment lands are generally the west end of the city, which may be not a good idea with prevailing westerlies. Maybe your cannabis would be, down the far eastern end. I don't know. It's worth looking at. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Can we also restrict the cannabis retail in a commercial zone so they're not right across from the school?
It's possible. I think there's requirements anyway under the Cannabis Act for how far you have to be from a school. So that's a Health Canada requirements for distance from a school.
Is it?
Yeah. But we can reflect that in zoning as well.
Mr. Chairman, Joe Mito again, if I could maybe chime in.
You don't think you can? I think you can for retail, but we haven't done any studies in retail. We usually do with the operating facilities.
So, Mr. Chair, yeah,
go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman, Joe Mito. So a couple years back, we did a technical amendment for actually both items that we're speaking to right now with regards to production and regards to recreational sales. Based on the production matter, Mayor Davis did speak to a site specific that was amended by council that incorporated a separation district. So that one is currently under appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So when applications come forward for a change of use, the buck stops with the building department, and the building department will then interpret both bylaws, the previous bylaw, which allowed agricultural uses to advance within our M2 zone, and then would also rely on the more updated regulations that were approved through that council amended implementing bylaw. I think we've not had a hearing yet on that, and it is just the one property on Hardy Road that's an appellant to that proceeding. I don't know if they're kind of holding their card to say we're going to see what happens with this new modernized bylaw. It's something that, as Paul suggested, we will be looking into with respect to those separating distances. I don't think they would hold so truthful if legal was to find a planner or someone to provide, expert witness testimony in that regard. I think that our council has had some issues, and I talk about our legal counsel having issues to see if someone could do that. So something that we will definitely look into, Mayor. As prior to that bylaw, we also provided kind of an update to council at the time with respect to recreational retail, recreation or medical, regardless, cannabis retail within the city. And what holds true, as always, would be the provincial criteria, guidelines, or regulations, and we can't exempt them from commercial areas. They just have to meet that specific minimum from those types of school sites or institutional sites, and what that separation distance. So those parameters are all established. So commercial retail is commercial retail. It goes on a case-by-case basis in terms of their application to the AGCO. And then we would, and as we continue to do, advise council members and the mayor with respect to any one application we do receive or licensing does receive from the AGCO.
Yes, Mr. Air.
Yeah, so I had a question, Joe. Joe, don't the provincial cannabis retail rules prevent us from dealing with them as a specific zoning use?
Correct.
Right, so really, we have no control over it so long as, and there's only the one requirement the province has, which if I recall correctly, is it's gotta be commercial zoning.
Correct.
And you have to be 250 meters away from a school.
Correct.
That's it.
That's it. We don't.
impose additional requirements.
That is correct.
Application that's gone to the GCO, Agricultural Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, and staff will provide comments back to them and indicate if something's within the separation distance, and suggest to them that they don't approve it, but ultimately it's not in our hands to approve those.
But one of the tests is it has the zoning. Right?
Commercial zone.
Right. But you have to have a commercial, but the commercial zoning has to permit it.
But I think what the mayor is saying, Paul, is that the commercial zones, like you can't establish cannabis retail facility as a use in a commercial zone. And what the province has basically said is you can't restrict it as well, right? Like no implementing bylaw can be passed by a council, which would allow the exemption, or let's say the restriction of such uses in their bylaws. So we don't really have a leg to stand on with respect to not permitting them or excluding them from the bylaw as a permitted use. I think what we can look into and what, the work that we did with respect to cannabis, once again, jumping the gun, cannabis production can be looked at in a little bit more detail. A lot of those provisions are basically established through the feds, through Health Canada.
It is, yes, that is by the Health Canada, and you can, their requirement is zoning, and you can restrict the zoning. It's the only place you can't restrict it totally is an agricultural zone, because it is an agricultural use. There's just been one recent OLT decision in Lower Medante on that, and they tried to restrict it completely, and that was overturned by the OLT.
I believe a private cannabis store is 150 meters from the school, not 250.
I see no committee hands up currently, so thank you, Paul, for the presentation. We'll move on to items for consideration, and the first one being the new zoning bylaw project strategic directions report. And report number 2023, number 27. Could I have a mover and a seconder to place the item on the floor, please? Moved by Mayor, second by Jane. So we have mover and a seconder. This is the time for any further discussion and the comments that the committee would like to forward to staff.
I would suggest, I believe Victoria has been sort of capturing the commentary, so if there's anything formal you want to include, this would be the time, but the discussion that's already occurred will be reflected in staff's report.
Okay, so that's great. Thank you very much. Is there anything else formally that members of the committee would like to add to this? I've got a couple of things. First off, I think that the user guide is a really good addition to this zoning bylaw. I do like the development zone. Essentially, it's kind of a holding thing for a lot of land until we've got it sorted out. I think those are really good items to add to it. And I think the idea of the angular plane being used as sort of a way of being able to buffer from low rise to high rise would get rid of some of the canyoning, or potentially get rid of won't get rid of existing canyoning, but it should keep at least initially some of that canyoning from taking place. So those would be the only comments that I would add. Is there anything else that committee members would like to add? Thank you very much. Do we need to move? Oh, yes. So we have to hold a vote then on this. So I will call the vote for all those in favor. Please show of hands. And I think we saw all the members of the committee with their hand up. Were there any opposed? Didn't see any hands up. Carried. Moving on then to item 5.2, amendments to chapter 26, schedule 27 regarding the special provisions. It's report number 2023-43. May I have a mover and seconder to place the item on the floor? Councillor Hunt. Can I second it?
No, you can't.
No, I didn't think so. And we have a seconder as well. So we are now in the phase where, is there any discussion and comments from the committee that we would like to put forward? Yes.
Just the questions we asked, if there's any changes we can make, if possible.
So through the chair, for this report regarding the amendment to the
No, sorry, not, I was thinking about the zoning bylaw.
So the zoning bylaw has already been voted on. If you want to have a conversation with our consultant afterwards, we can arrange a specific.
Thank you.
Contact
No,
at that
not for this, thanks.
Yeah, so this is in regard to it sounds like it's more of a technical change to the schedule so that, but I'll let the report author.
Yes, so through the
speak
chair,
to it.
so through the chair, the purpose of this report is really just to capture a challenge that we were seeing frequently. This is the only committee that requires a formal memo to be voted on and provided to council. And the past iterations of this committee were really struggling to achieve quorum, and then the memo wouldn't move forward. And so staff were kind of having some difficulties progressing items. And so this just allows those items to move forward without that memo. The memo will still be provided to staff. It's just, there's no formal requirement to have it be voted on.
Is there any further discussion on this? Seeing none from the committee, then I will call it for a vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And I have all hands up. There weren't any opposed. One in opposition? No, okay. Thank you. The motion has carried then. Moving on to item 6, there are no consent items. And item 7, there are no resolutions. Item 8, notices of motion. There were no notices of motion put forward. And so business being completed, our meeting is officially adjourned.
Very good, Chair.
Thanks.